Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story is told about a red-haired girl who came to a clearing and planted a seed. As soon as she finished planting, she immediately stood up and, sighing heavily, was glad that this difficult process was finally completed, despite the fact that she even liked all of it. She also remembered at that moment what had happened earlier, namely how her parents had reacted to her applying to go to college to become a farmer. Of course, everyone was incredibly surprised then and did not understand how she could even come to such a conclusion. The girl was then, of course, very surprised and asked why they considered farming bad, because, you see, the future of the country lay precisely in the land, and she considered it a very correct choice. But her family and friends didn't think so. Her mother even raised her hand at her out of extreme anger and said that she didn't think so at all, and also that it was definitely a terrible choice for a profession for the rest of her life. The woman also continued to scream and asked why, of all the people around her, she decided to worry only about the future of the country and not about her own or her family and friends. When the girl finally planted the seed, she became very interested in how her dear Madame Panok was doing on these warm days. Of course, her mother would never have imagined this life on a farm, surrounded by trees and wheat. However, for the girl, it brought incredible pleasure. Of course, her mother could not believe the fact that her daughter, who was alienated for entering agricultural college, would lead an agricultural revolution in another world. In fact, she used to be surrounded by dazzling chandeliers, beautiful flowers of absolutely different shades, and people who were elegantly dressed in luxurious dresses and expensive suits. And in the midst of all this, one day a man approached her, who had been watching her closely the whole time. He walked up to poor Lena and told her straight to her face that he would break off their engagement. Of course, this took the girl by surprise. She could not believe that he actually said this at such an important event, and so suddenly. In fact, a few minutes ago, before he confessed this to her, she was just making coffee in her kitchen, and after that she heard some strange sound, very similar to an explosion. So when she closed her ears and opened her eyes the next time, she found herself in a completely different place. The man standing next to her immediately frowned and asked, was she faking pain again in order not to interfere with all this? However, he frowned and added that such cheap tricks wouldn't work on him anymore, so she might as well not even try. The girl was a little surprised when she heard this. She looked at the man for a while and then asked, "Is he really Crown Prince David?" The man sighed heavily and asked, was she really going to pretend that she had lost her memory now? He also said with irritation in his voice that he was terribly tired of all her games for the public. He looked Lena straight in the eye and replied that he had only become engaged to her because it was his father's will. However, he had suspected her of unclean deeds from the very beginning. The girl herself stood with a very surprised expression on her face. It only took her a little while to realize what was going on around her. It was only after several days that she finally realized that this place she had somehow been transported to was from a novel she had read in her past life. This story was called I Became a Saint in Another World. And as you can already understand from the title, this is a romantic fantasy where the main character is a girl from a completely different world. And the girl who was standing arm in arm with David at that moment was called Christina Sienna, and she was the main character of this story. And as in most stories, she charmed many followers with her sweet and interesting personality. Everyone around her, of course, loved and appreciated her. And the one who constantly humiliated her was dissatisfied with her charm. And she, of course, was the most typical villain, as in any story. And this villain turned out to be Lena, who somehow miraculously moved into this character after the explosion that happened in her past life. Thinking back on her past and present life, she realized that it wasn't that bad. However, she was very sad about the fact that she had been transported into a villainous character. Moreover, even with the return of her memories, she still cannot do anything to somehow change the current situation and make it better. In fact, she initially moved to the episode of her fall. The story was written that the villain Lena, who was the crown princess until that moment, had now fallen to the lowest level and become a commoner. Of course, from the very beginning, the girl was incredibly worried. However, she understood that she needed to calm down a little because something was wrong with the time. Lena knew very well that she was thrown out because of her terrible behavior towards Christina. However, now that she thinks about it, she realizes the fact that she didn't even insult her for her lack of etiquette. Lena could also make fun of her for wearing the same dress all the time. However, this did not happen, so the girl did not understand at all why he was going to call off this engagement. For a while, she just stood there and looked at David, whose arm was being hugged by the main character of the story. On top of all this, that day was Lena's birthday, and she was turning 20 years old, the day when her fiancé, Crown Prince David, was supposed to propose to her. However, there was no way back for her. When the girl was returning home in the carriage, she screamed very loudly because she remembered something. Lena didn't understand why her memory had to return at this time. After the engagement was broken, she couldn't do anything to change the situation, and so she was simply desperate. Of course, she read this story very well and knew the plot perfectly, so she understood that now only troubles awaited her ahead. After all, the most basic plot that she could change, and this would affect her future life, had already passed. At that moment, she began to approach the estate where she lived with her father, and realized that at this speed, trouble was inevitable. And the moment the carriage stopped at the entrance, she immediately met her father on the way, who looked incredibly angry. He turned to his daughter and said that she had disgraced him. Lena reacted to this quite calmly, because she knew perfectly well what would happen now. She greeted her father, and he just started yelling at her, saying that he would erase her name from the family, and also adding that if she wanted to say something, she should do it immediately, since this would be the last time they would communicate in any way. In fact, in the original, Lena was very stubborn in this part of the story as well. She started trying to prove to her father that it wasn't her fault and wanted to ask him to leave her at home. But in the end, she made the Duke incredibly angry and she was simply thrown out into the street. However, in this world, now that the girl had reincarnated as this character, she was not going to let that happen. Lena knew that she could not live with only her bare hands and no money at all. In this world, home visits from doctors were incredibly expensive, so poor people had to turn to shamans when they fell ill. And the treatment from these shamans, to put it mildly, was not very good. They simply sucked the soul out of a person and left him, like a ghost, to live the rest of his life. Of course, Lena, knowing this very well, was incredibly scared and did not want something like this to happen to her. At that moment, she understood perfectly well that if a person has no money, then he cannot even afford to get sick. And it was for this very reason that she couldn't allow her father to just kick her out like that. So the girl, kneeling down, immediately folded her hands together and began to beg her father. Lena burst into tears and screamed loudly, asking him not to throw her out. She said that from now on, she would live correctly and calmly, so as not to let him down anymore. Of course, as soon as the man heard this, he was incredibly surprised, and he thought about it seriously for some time. However, then he smiled and, turning to the guards, told them to throw her out immediately. Thus, Lena could not escape the same cruelty as in the original story. She found herself completely without anything outside the gates of her parents' house. The girl, sighing heavily, suddenly laughed because she was overcome with emotion, and she understood that in just a few hours, her life would be completely destroyed even more. She sat on the ground for a while, and then suddenly she became angry. She ran to the gate and started knocking on it, shouting her father's name all the time. The girl burst into tears again, and said that she had now become an ordinary person without a penny, and did not understand how she should live in this hopeless state now. Lena was silent for a moment and wondered if she should just keep screaming until they opened the door. However, before the girl had time to make up her mind, a maid suddenly came out from behind her. Her name was Nani, and she turned to Lena. As soon as the girl turned around, she immediately saw her all in tears. After that, she looked back and saw the carriage. Without thinking twice, she immediately ran up to her maid and asked, was it really her father who had organized this place for her? She even suggested that her tears and hysteria had somehow affected and touched her father's heart. However, Nani, wiping away her tears, said that this was not so. Of course, despite the fact that Lena still had hope, she understood perfectly well that this could not be. Then the maid explained that the master had ordered her to send Lena, but she could not let her go, of course, in such a state. So the woman suggested that she go to her hometown for a while. It was a pretty quiet place and safe, so she could spend some time there and figure out what to do next. Of course, as soon as Lena heard this, she couldn't believe her happiness, because it really was an incredibly generous offer on her part. She got into the carriage with her maid and felt very lost. In the end, she was kicked out just like in the original story, and Lena didn't know what to do now. Even though she knew the plot, she still didn't expect that everything would go differently than she had expected. Then suddenly, seeing her sad expression, Nani grabbed her hands and told her not to be too surprised, because the owner knew that it was not her fault. The maid also added that this was probably just a way of telling her to wait patiently until society calmed down and there were other gossips to discuss. But no matter how much the maid tried to persuade her, Lena wasn't sure about it. And all because in the last part of the novel that she read, Ravina appears, and this means the end for her. The girl suggested that perhaps after being thrown out without a penny, she eventually fell ill and died in some random place. And even just the thought of it scared her very much. So Lena, unable to contain her emotions, suddenly stood up and screamed, saying that it was too terrible for her. Of course, the maid was a little surprised, but she tried to calm her down. As Lena sat on her side, she thought that if her memories had returned a little earlier, she might have been able to change the whole situation. However, then the girl thought about how she would change everything, and eventually came to the conclusion that Crown Prince David would definitely not have abandoned her. However, in reality, this man was incredibly insensitive, arrogant, and narcissistic. So Lena came to the conclusion that perhaps it was even better that she was not with him, because he was the very embodiment of an egoist in reality. And she decided that it was precisely because he was like that he fell in love with Christina, the woman who dared to talk to him about equality and his shortcomings right to his face. Their relationship was something special, and he considered her the very first woman who dared to hit him when he did something wrong. Such men, of course, have excellent love from readers in novels. However, if some woman lived with him in real life, she would probably just go crazy because this man is impossible. And besides all this, even if he hadn't left Lynn, of course, her life would definitely not have been happy. She would always have to obey him and do everything only as the man says. Therefore, while she was riding in the carriage with the maid, she managed to change her mind several times, but she agreed on the fact that it was very good that things turned out this way. She thought that this could be seen as the fact that she had finally gained freedom and would start living a real life, and not just doing everything the way others told her to, or what they expected of her. Because Lena was very tired and the day was incredibly emotional, she fell asleep very quickly and didn't even notice how it happened. The girl was awakened by Nana's voice, who screamed loudly and said that she needed to wake up already, because they had finally arrived at the right place. After the girl woke up and got out of the carriage, she was incredibly surprised. She looked at the destroyed house that stood nearby and could not understand where she even ended up. Nana burst into tears again at that moment and said that this was all she could do for her. Unfortunately, she had nothing more to give. When the lady turned to her, she began to hug her very tightly and kept asking for forgiveness for not being able to offer luxury. Lena was, of course, very surprised, but she said that everything was fine, and it was still an incredibly big risk for her. She brought her to this place and did it knowing that all this could lead to the unimaginable wrath of her father. So, hugging her back, she said that even such an act meant an incredible amount to her, and she was truly grateful even for such conditions. She also said that if they ever saw her again, they would definitely repay this kindness. Nana, finally releasing her from his tight embrace, said that she shouldn't worry about it, because one day, when she becomes useful, the Duke will come for her again. When Lena heard the word useful, she was very surprised, because she could not believe that a person dear to her could simply use her and throw her out when he thought about it, and then return her when he needed her. And hearing this from her dear nanny, she only felt worse and sadder about it all. Then suddenly the girl realized that they had left her in this place so that she could prepare for something that might happen later. Before getting back into the carriage, the nanny said goodbye to her and said that they would definitely see each other again. Lena also waved goodbye to her and told her to get there safely. And the girl herself at that moment thought that this was Nana. And she definitely couldn't do this to her. So she threw away all these terrible thoughts and decided to accept the situation as it was. Lena assumed that she was probably just feeling pretty sensitive about her broken engagement, so she didn't dwell on the conspiracy theory. As the carriage drove away from her, she opened the door and thought that she needed to be a little more positive, after all. At least she had avoided spending the night on the bare ground in the cold street, so that was already good. However, it became a little more difficult for her to think positively once she entered this ruined house and saw the whole situation around her. Of course, she knew perfectly well that Nana had done everything to help her. However, in reality, the state of this house was incredibly bad, and she did not even know how she would live in it. She was so overwhelmed with emotion that she couldn't even stand on her feet and fell to the ground. Now she looked like a completely poor and lonely woman. Lena even burst into tears, because in fact she was born with a silver spoon in her mouth, And in one moment, everything reached such a deplorable situation that she simply cannot even spend the night in good conditions. It was also incredibly cold in this house, and then suddenly she felt something fall on her head. Lena immediately realized that it was a drop of water. Then she looked around and saw that the roof of this house was leaking, and various flasks were placed around to prevent the floor from getting wet. Also, in all corners of this house, there was a web with different types of spiders. All the boards were cracked, scratched, and even had holes. For a while, Lena sat on the floor and felt sorry for herself, but then she stood up and thought that since this was her life now, she should accept the situation and not just lie there and feel sorry for herself. Of course, her life was now simply disgusting. The house was destroyed, and besides, she didn't even have food, so her peaceful and calm existence turned into a field for survival. However, Lena was not the type to just despair and do nothing else. She was not going to just sit there and starve to death, so she picked up a hammer and started patching up her roof. And so, several months passed from that moment, and people living nearby began to notice that someone had actually settled in this dilapidated house, because before that, these were just rumors. A man who was walking with the family said that many were saying that she was the Duke's daughter, but he had not seen even a trace of her presence. Then one woman, suddenly turning her head to the side, asked, maybe she had been dead for a long time. However, then the question arose, who lives in this house? Her daughter suddenly noticed a chicken sitting in a cage, and the man, noticing where they were looking, said that since she was raising chickens, he thought she was still alive. They all immediately began to examine this unfortunate animal, but the woman suddenly noticed that this chicken was very similar to hers, which had run away from home a few days ago. Lena, who was hiding behind the house at that moment, did not understand what she meant when she called this chicken hers, because everything that landed on her land became hers. And she certainly wasn't going to give it up for anything, because that chicken was her source of protein. So if someone started taking the chicken away from her, she was even ready to attack. But at that moment, a little girl who heard some whispering behind the house immediately went to look. She turned to her mother when she saw the silhouette of a person and said that someone was there. The woman, hearing this, immediately approached her daughter and asked if this was really so. And the daughter, looking at Lena, asked if she was sure that this woman was the Duke's daughter because she looked very untidy and unkempt. Her mother, upon hearing these words, immediately became indignant and asked how she could speak like that to an unfamiliar lady, and immediately felt ashamed of the upbringing of her daughter. The woman turned to Lena, apologized for her daughter's behavior, and assured her that she would have an educational talk with her so that something like this would not happen again. Lena, meanwhile, took off her hood and, handing them a hot potato, offered to try the sweet potato that she had just cooked. She wanted to appear welcoming so that these people would not be angry with her, and she hoped that perhaps they could become friends. Luckily for Lena, the climate where she settled was very similar to what she was used to in her previous life in Korea. In other words, it was ideal land for growing staple crops. All the plants that could be bought or grown in that place were familiar to her, so she felt confident. Lena let the family into her home and gave each of them a sweet potato. They all peeled the skin and immediately tried it. The little girl, her mother and grandfather, having tried this delicacy, were delighted. It was incredibly tasty. The man suddenly slammed his hand on the table and asked if such delicious food could really grow in such a region. After all, he had previously had to eat bland and even raw food. Lena beamed with happiness and asked if they didn't know about it and added that this sweet potato can be found everywhere. She also said that she took some seedlings to plant near the house. The woman, reaching for more, said that it was really very tasty. Lena, of course, allowed her to take more because she had a lot of potatoes. After that, Lena asked how much apples cost in this place. The man, thinking, answered that 3 apples cost 1 coin. Hearing this, Lena was upset. She did not expect that apples would be so expensive. She was silent for a while and then said that nothing in this world comes for free. So she decided to set the price of sweet potatoes, 6 for 1 gold coin. Some time passed from that moment, and in the end, Lena lived in this place for 4 whole years. During this time, she was able to develop her production so much that she had her own farm and was doing what she loved. She was able to adapt even to the thunderstorms that sometimes happened, and acquired many useful things not only for her home, but also for the farm. Of course, all this was not as simple as it might seem, and even 2 years later, things were still going quite difficult for Lena. She found herself in crisis. Although sweet potatoes brought in good income at the beginning of her journey, over time people learned to harvest them themselves. Lena realized that she needed to find a new niche to develop and earn more. She also noticed that the villagers sold the apples immediately after they ripened. She then decided that her next big breakthrough would be apples. Beautiful, incredibly tasty, and very healthy. In this place, no one knew anything about farming or growing food. Lena wasn't sure if the locals understood how much effort it took to grow perfect apples. These efforts could only pay off when someone tried the apple and started spreading the word about it. And so it happened. Lena sold one of her apples to a woman who then showed it to others. The people were amazed. They had never seen such red, ripe, and sweet apples. They claimed that such beauty was worthy of being an offering to the Lord of the land. Hearing this, Lena was slightly surprised and even indignant. She didn't understand what the Lord had to do with it, but people admired her apples so much that they were ready to fight for them. Eventually, the apple was taken to a woman who was called the Lord of the Earth. Lena ran after them, wanting to know why they took her apple. She saw an old woman who was interested in this amazing fruit. Lena was amazed. She could not believe that an old woman could be the god of the earth. The woman took the apple and said that she did not believe that such a huge fruit could be an apple. She also asked what kind of magic was used to grow it. Looking closely at the apple, she noted that it was incredibly delicious. At this point, Lena intervened and said that everything was actually simple. She was a brilliant farmer who knew all the intricacies. The woman asked in surprise if she was the girl who was Lord Pon's daughter. Lena was stunned and asked how the woman knew about her. The old lady replied that of course she knew, because the whole district was talking about it. She added that she had even received reports about how Lena was successfully farming and living peacefully in her little house. However, she always believed that this was a lie, because the Duke's daughter would not take up farming. Lena laughed nervously, thinking that the woman probably thought she was just hiring people to do the work. In reality, Lena did most of the work herself, although later, as production grew, she began hiring assistants. Lena felt offended. All this time she worked hard, and the woman never tried to help her or even support her with words, knowing that she lives and works here. However, since she already knew that Lena was the Duke's daughter, she asked for 1 gold coin for the apple. As soon as the woman heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Is she really saying that she needs to pay for this apple?" The girl smiled and said that of course it was, because this apple was like a child to her, and because of the poor harvest this year, she had only managed to grow a few of these beauties. The woman was so surprised that she even raised her voice and asked, was she really saying that she had a few more of these apples? Lena was very surprised and said in a trembling voice that of course it was small, but she was still able to gather a harvest. Then the woman asked, hadn't she thought about the fact that their offer could bring her a reward that would be much larger and more valuable than gold? But the girl answered with complete confidence in her voice that gambling was definitely not for her, so she didn't want to think about it. The woman smiled and said that she was certainly quite a brave young lady, and she even thought that in a week, Lena would come crying at the gates of her estate. She also asked if Lena could grow any other fruits. The girl replied that, of course, the peaches she grows are incredibly sweet and tender. Their juice just flows, and you get incredible pleasure. The woman thought about it at that moment and said nothing more. Alina wondered what she was thinking about for so long. She also assumed that she was captivated by fresh, juicy peaches, so she thought about how to take some for herself. And so, after finally some time of silence, the woman handed her an apple and said that she would hire her as a gardener on her estate. She would very much like Lena to grow fruit trees on her estate. However, the girl quickly replied that she does not take on subcontracted work. Lena explained that growing and selling fruit herself is much more profitable for her, and she does not understand why she should get involved with strangers at all. It would only be extra stress for her. However, at that moment, the woman asked how she planned to manage all this alone, since there were even rumors that her family, the Duke's house, had completely cut off ties with her. She explained that she had no one to support her now. However, Lena replied that she, as her mistress, could invest in her, and then they would both be in a profitable position. Lena explained that in that case she would be very grateful if the woman also offered her protection, since a person like her, without strong support, becomes an easy target as soon as she acquires any wealth. The woman, hearing this proposal, immediately smiled and said that she was quite cheap, but still agreed, saying that since she was so confident in herself, she could trust her. She handed the apple to her assistant and also told him to give the girl whatever she asked for and to go to her house to collect all the apples. The woman said that she should not have a single apple left. She would like to see absolutely all of these beautiful works of art in her yard. As soon as Lena heard this, she beamed with joy because she had done what she had wanted. the girl was able to sell all her apples for no less than 20 gold coins. And the next year, she grew peaches, which she sold at an even higher price. Thus, she was able to earn a lot of money. Soon, her fruits became so famous that even neighboring lords began to demand them, so that the offer of sponsorship and purchase increased several times. With this money, she was able to buy land, hire workers, and even started raising a cat. At this point, she would call her life with the estate a huge success, and she was really happy with what she had achieved. One day, the woman who was her sponsor came to her farm and said that Crown Prince David, whom she had so abruptly rejected, had recently gotten married, and she wondered if Lena was interested in what was going on in his story. After all, if he hadn't been so fickle, even she could have become a queen. However, the girl, turning away from the woman, said that in fact she was not at all interested in his life. She ran forward, and the wind began to blow her beautiful red hair. Lena, smiling, said that she loved farming and taking care of it all. She would never trade her life for the life of a queen. The woman decided that now her second life would end as a successful farmer, and she was not at all upset by this. She was actually proud of the successes she had achieved all this time. All the people bought various fruits from her, and she really did have regular customers because the taste of these things was just unreal. One day, Lena, walking through her gardens, did not notice a stone, accidentally tripped over it and fell. In fact, she had not yet seen it, because she was thinking about what she should grow next. At first, the girl thought it was really a stone. However, when she turned her head to the side, she saw an unusual plant. She noticed in this plant the perfectly straight lines and elegantly flowing curves that formed a hoe. When she took it out of the ground, she was incredibly happy and did not understand why such a rare instrument was buried in the ground. Lena even hugged him. She thought she would never see him again, because everyone in this world only uses flower trowels for farm work. The girl also found it very surprising why people use a flower shovel if they have something so practical. So she wanted to take this shovel and definitely use it because it is a very good tool. However, at that moment, she suddenly heard a voice coming from the shoulder blade and was very surprised. However, this voice addressed her, asking, "Is she really now its new owner?" Lena, of course, was incredibly surprised because she was not used to the fact that instruments could talk to her. In fact, in her past life, the girl would have been shocked to see a talking hoe. However, in this world, magic was actually a common thing. Having adapted perfectly to this otherworldly world, Lena was a little surprised, but not so much if she had not been aware of all these subtleties. And besides all this, she, of course, took this shovel for herself because she could not simply leave it in the form of a rock, this precious thing, for more than 4 years. But at that moment, the instrument suddenly fell out of her hands and began to circle around the girl, and after that she looked at her hand and saw a sign that had formed there. This voice from the shoulder blade immediately said that the contract was concluded. That is, now it belonged to the girl. The tool turned into a sword, and he spoke again, saying that his name was Louis Handberg III, and he also said that she could consider it an honor to be his 10th master. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She did not understand at all what was being discussed, because she simply wanted a magical instrument for herself, with which she could work more easily. But in fact, now, after some time, she came to the conclusion that it would have been better to throw this hoe away from the moment she first spoke to her, because this was not such a great chance for her. Lena just stood there for a moment and looked at the sword, and then said that she was absolutely sure that she had just picked up a hoe. And now she had a beautiful sword in front of her. The girl was simply horrified. She wondered how this could have happened, and did not understand what kind of master she had become and what she should do now. That voice from the sword spoke to her again and said that if he told her the story of his creation, even 10 handkerchiefs would not be enough, so he decided to be a little short. Lena, hearing such a pretentious tone, was a little upset and even wary, but still decided to listen to the story. This sword, which was called Louis, spoke to her, saying that it was forged by the god of abundance, Bonecarl, in 3 days and nights. And this abundance lived inside him. That's why many wanted to get this sword. However, few succeeded. And all because this instrument was incredibly smart and resourceful, and it allowed only those who were destined to become emperors to control it. However, in his opinion, 9 times would have been enough for him. He did not want to be possessed any further. At that moment, Lena wondered what was wrong with this creature, because if he talked so much about emperors, he probably liked to brag and had a rather high opinion of himself. But Louis continued his story, saying that at some point, more and more unqualified fools were trying to become his master, and he got so fed up, so he decided to just disguise himself. At this point, the girl finally began to understand something and asked, "Does this really mean that he wants her to pick him up and become his new owner?" Lena also looked at the sign that appeared on her hand. She understood that she had found something strange and did not want to harm herself or others. So she even thought about how she could cancel all of this. But before she could say anything, the sword suddenly screamed and said that it was at that moment that her master recognized its true value, even in its revealed and humble form. Louis said that the girl had eyes that could see the beauty of a flower hidden in the mud, and that was why he appeared before her in his true form. Lena was very worried because she actually just picked it up because she needed a hoe, but she certainly couldn't even guess that such power was hidden under it. Louis flew closer to her and said that she really had the quality of a ruler, so she was getting her blessing from him. The girl tried to move away from this weapon and said that she thought that he misunderstood her because she was an ordinary farmer and did not even know how to wield a sword to somehow communicate with him. As soon as Louis heard this, he said that it certainly didn't matter who she was. However, Lena began to insist on her own and said that he had stayed in this form for a long time in order to find a suitable master for himself, and in that case, he needed to turn to someone more courageous, wiser, who would be ideal for him. For a while, the sword was silent and carefully examined her from head to toe, and after that proudly said that she had wise eyes, and humility was also visible, so she was now his master. The girl, hearing this, sighed heavily and thought that she just wanted to take care of her farm and not get involved with ruling and swords. She also realized that arguing was completely useless and decided that nothing terrible would happen if she carried a talking sword in a fantasy world. Perhaps she would even find it useful someday. In fact, since she didn't have a family now and she was pretty bored, she decided to consider this Louis as her communication partner. So she agreed and said that they could still sign this contract. Louis was immediately delighted and said that she should live long and bring him joy until she became old and gray. Only after that he would allow himself to move on and find a new owner, when he would definitely no longer need her. After this meeting, Lena went to have tea with the elderly woman who was her sponsor. All this time the girl was tense and told the woman that something strange was happening in the area these days. At some point, the trees and grass started to grow very well. Lena also said that she was very surprised by the fact that the Hoya in her office bloomed for the first time in 7 years. The elderly woman did not understand what was so special about this and immediately asked, "Is it really that wonderful?" Lena, who brought them new fruits, began to peel them and said that thanks to the good sunshine, the weather this year was really amazing to her, and it was helping her crops grow better. She also said that perhaps God really does help them because sometimes such things can happen. Also thinking, Lena said that when a dog gives birth, 8 puppies are born, and when a chicken lays eggs, they always have 2 yolks. So now people started looking for eggs with more than 2 yolks, doing it for fun. The old woman immediately asked if it was strange and began to eat the fruit that the girl had given her. Lena replied that it was good to be in abundance, and also added that she was a very good person, and for her, it was quite valuable. However, the old woman still did not calm down. She stabbed another piece of this fruit with her fork and said that it was still strange, no matter how she thought about it. It still seemed unusual to her. Lena didn't respond to this. She thought that if she were in her place, she would simply say, "Great." However, the woman is still very cautious, so she was very surprised that such a person could immediately trust her in terms of business. However, at that moment she suddenly noticed her hand and asked why she had bandages. Also in an anxious voice she asked, "Has the girl really gotten hurt somewhere?" Lena immediately stopped cutting the fruit, and looking at her bandage, thought about how she should explain all this to her, because she couldn't say that it was a dark dragon. So smiling nervously, she said that she was not hurt at all, but the last time she walked around the farm, she discovered something strange. As soon as the woman heard this, she became even more worried and asked if she had cut herself with metal. But without even waiting for an answer, she said that she needed to quickly remove the bandage and treat the wound, because she could even die that way. Lena immediately tried to calm her down and said that she was not injured at all, but that at that moment she had just gotten a rather strange tattoo. In order to show that she was right, she immediately began to unwind the bandage and said that she did not want this either, but it somehow ended up on her hand. The moment Lena showed it, the woman immediately replied that she understood everything and asked her to wrap it back up. As soon as the girl heard this, she was a little surprised and could not understand why she took it so calmly, because she thought that she would immediately ask how this could happen and ask for details. But at that moment, the elderly woman, sighing heavily, said that she suddenly had a very bad headache and asked if she could leave earlier that day. Of course, Lena was very surprised, but she said that she would do it without any problems. So she got up from her seat and began to walk towards the exit. She glanced at her employer and noticed that she was not the type to send people away just because she was sick. She also wondered if perhaps the woman was really very sick, and that was the reason she did it. Lena decided that the next day she would definitely come to her and bring fresh vegetables so that she could cook some broth for herself and get well soon. So, thinking about all this, Lena finally returned home and found the party that was just waiting for her. She immediately ran up to Louis, who was sitting in the corner, and asked him why he was so angry, and also asked him to come closer to her. The sword quickly flew up to her and asked, did she really dare to shamelessly come to him and even demand something after using a completely different sword? As soon as Lena heard this, she was very surprised. She didn't understand who could use a sword as long and expensive as him just to cut a melon. She could even imagine how much her finger would hurt if she actually used it for this purpose. However, in order not to anger her friend even more, she said that she could not carry a weapon in front of the mistress, so she had to leave him for this time. So the girl said that he would probably be more upset if he was in the hands of a guard or just lying on the ground while she did her job. Louis didn't answer this. He just turned away from her and continued to frown. But the girl decided to cheer him up and said that he was the most amazing thing in this world, so sharp that he could even split the sky. As soon as the sword heard this, he immediately became embarrassed and told her to just leave. However, Lena was not going to back down. She came up to him and hugged the instrument, saying that next time she would definitely take it with her and brag about how cool it was. So she asked him to just calm down now. Louis didn't believe her right away and looking at her asked if she promised to do it. Of course, at times like this, everything seemed like a wonderful living being. However, she still couldn't believe that an ordinary sword could actually have such a vulnerable soul. She liked the fact that this island was truly unique, and she could see things that she would never see in her homeland. So Lena promised him, and after that they made peace. In fact, this sword not only could speak, but it could also freely change its shape into whatever it needed. And besides, it can even emit light from itself like a flashlight. It was really very beneficial for the girl and convenient. But of course, for Lena, the hoe was still the best image for this ball. Then suddenly Louis turned to her and asked what terrible thoughts were coming into her head when she looked at him like that. Lena decided to change the subject and said that, while talking about this, the Lord mentioned something rather strange to her, and the sword immediately asked what it was. And she answered that recently the territory had been very prosperous, and the cattle had given birth to a great many young heirs, and the fruits and grain harvests had brought in very abundant quantities. With a smile on her face, she asked if it wasn't wonderful. And Louis, raising his voice at that moment, said that it was all thanks to his blessing, because otherwise they would have been going on for a long time. She immediately frowned and asked him what he was saying, since all he did was fly around her room when he was bored, and he didn't do any important work at all. However, Louis, becoming wary, immediately began to defend himself and said that he was actually created with the utmost devotion by God and forgotten, and it is quite natural that the earth where he lives brings forth crops and cattle multiply, and he does not at all have to make any effort for this. Lena was tired of talking about it, so she said that let it be as he said. But Louis began to insist on his own and tried to prove to her that it was all thanks to him. The girl also said that she needed to go and check the field before it was too late. It was already getting dark very early, and she didn't want to expose herself to unnecessary danger. Louis wondered, didn't he say that he was the state? When there was plenty of food, people would gather and naturally form a state. That was why their ancestors had begun to create civilizations in rich and developed lands since ancient times. At this point, Lena smiled and asked, had their little Louis really already learned such long and complex words? However, the sword, indignant, asked, does she really think that he is some 8-year-old child? But the girl didn't have time to say anything else, because someone knocked on their door and asked if there was anyone inside. Lena immediately became wary. She went to the exit to see who it was. In fact, she heard a man's voice, but no one should have come to her at such a time. The girl always told everyone that at such times she was closed to visitors, and especially to visitors from any male. However, when she approached the door and looked out the window, through which it was possible to see who was standing behind her, she noticed that this person was not alone, but was also accompanied by several strong young men. Lena whispered to her ball and said that it all looked a little suspicious. Louis was immediately very surprised and asked what she meant. However, he quickly understood what she was getting at, and overjoyed, said that it was finally time to show his skills. He could turn this entrance into a sea of blood. Just tell him you need it. Lena immediately whispered that he shouldn't talk nonsense, because a sea of blood would definitely reduce the value of the property. She also confidently told him not to move until she used him. Of course, Louis didn't like it, but he told her to act independently, because since she was his master, she should be brave, and he, if anything, would help at any moment. Even though she didn't like the way her sword reacted, she still opened the door and then wanted to ask who was there. But when she saw the man in front of her, she immediately fell silent. This man was incredibly handsome. He had beautiful golden straight hair and blue eyes. Lena, hearing his voice and looking at his appearance, immediately froze in place. He was really amazing, and she could not figure out who this stunning guy was. However, as soon as she opened the door, he immediately said that he had finally found her and also called her a thief cat. Lena began to smile and wondered what he was saying. She really didn't understand why his choice of words didn't match his elegant face. He seemed very polite, even a gentleman. In fact, when she looked at his face, she simply could not look away. It was as if he was hypnotizing her, and she decided, because of the emotions that had fallen upon her, to even say something stupid. The girl, continuing to smile, asked if by any chance he was her little kitten, and to get acquainted. Hearing this, of course, he was immediately very surprised, and Lena now even understood that she had answered this question very stupidly, and even regretted it. In fact, sometime before this happened, the lady who was Lena's sponsor received guests in her palace. The man who spoke to her said that such a law definitely did not exist, and he did not understand why she then declared him guilty. However, the Empress replied that in that case, it would be the first time. He, of course, did not understand what she was saying at all, and how she could come up with her own laws in this situation. But the woman, without even turning to him, said that perhaps she wouldn't mind him being the first friend in that sense. For example, she wondered if it wouldn't be better to be the wife who couldn't bear the tedious process of divorce and ended up just killing her husband. In fact, after she talked to him about it, she even thought that her existence was now forever forgotten among humans. However, she was wrong. And all because Cayman Marshall, who was the emperor of the Marshall Empire, came to visit the Empress. The fair-haired man, smiling, said that he was really glad to see that she was completely healthy and called her his grandmother. The woman sitting opposite him said that she wanted to tell him something. However, Cayman, frowning slightly, immediately asked her to lower her tone, since she was the Empress. The woman, having calmed down a little, replied that the relationship had ended the moment the divorce was announced in the cathedral, and she also expected His Majesty to treat her as a simple Lady Orally, and not as his grandmother. However, the guy was even a little amused by all this, and he said that he really liked the fruits that she sent him. Then suddenly Cayman, frowning, said that he did not even understand what kind of fruit this was. This was a gift that Darien blessed with banners. The Empress at this point sighed heavily and thought that she simply wanted to send fruits or yen to her children because they looked beautiful. However, she could not even imagine that such a situation could happen, so she said that it was just a misunderstanding. When he said that this was not true, the Empress was very surprised, and he explained that the fact that the sword had disappeared from the imperial palace at the same time as the divorce and estrangement and the unusually bad harvest in her country made him a little wary. Cayman asked, "Is she really saying that these two events have nothing to do with each other?" The Empress, ignoring his rude tone, said that she had absolutely nothing to be ashamed of before the heavens, and she certainly had not done anything like that. Also, while sipping her afternoon tea, the woman said that on the day she renounced the name of Marshall, she left everything in the imperial palace, and he himself knew this very well. However, her grandson was not going to give it to her and asked where the sword was in that case, since it was not in the palace. But the woman only replied that it was not her property, so she did not even have the right to take it. Cayman didn't quite understand what she was talking about, so he asked for an explanation, and the Empress explained that one of her vassals had made a contract with this sword. The guy was starting to get really angry and asked with the sharpness of his teeth, does she really expect him to be able to believe it now? However, the Empress, despite being very irritated, looked calm and said that no matter how much this old woman interrogated His Highness, it was still the truth, and she would not tell him anything new. So the woman decided to redirect him to the farmer who was in charge of all these fruits. She said her name and told him where Lena lived, and it was for this reason that Cayman was now standing at her door. The girl, after her unfortunate question, quickly corrected herself and asked, "Has he really come to see her?" The guy, smiling happily, said that it was indeed so. And she was very wary, because he was definitely not a commoner, because he spoke to her quite respectfully and observed all the manners, unlike the other villagers. And besides, he had mentioned something about a kitten earlier. She couldn't believe that such a stunningly handsome guy could call her a kitten, so her whole face even turned red from embarrassment. When Lena turned away from him so that he would not see her too emotional, he suddenly turned to her and said that he would like to talk to her. However, she replied that whatever happened there, she could hear it at the entrance, because she believed that it was not a puzzle that had broken into her lonely woman's house, so she would not want to let him in. However, at that moment, a dark-haired man appeared behind her and shouting at her said that it was very impudent of her to say such things. Lena was surprised by this behavior and, frowning, said that he should not tell her that he came to her at this time and continues to expect that she will communicate with them politely. The guy was very surprised by this. He was not used to being talked to in such a way, so he was about to continue arguing with her. However, he did not even have time to say another word. Cayman intervened in their argument and asked them to stop, because he didn't have time for all this. The dark-haired man immediately calmed down and fell silent. At this point, Lena assumed that this handsome man was most likely of quite a high status, since that guy listened to him quite easily. However, when she looked at the man again, she could not understand why he had come looking for her, and also assumed that he might be interested in her land or agricultural skills. However, the girl also understood that, despite his handsome appearance and wonderful manners, she still should not give in to what he asked. After a short silence, the man said that he was the owner of the sword she had, and he had come specifically to take it back for himself. When Lena heard this, she was very surprised. She immediately turned nervously to Lewis and asked if he really had another owner. The sword immediately replied that he had absolutely no idea what she was talking about, since she was the only one who owned it. The girl was completely confused at that point. She looked at the man and said that it probably wasn't so, and also wondered if this guy really played both sides. Lewis immediately got angry and started yelling at her, saying that he didn't really say anything and didn't understand why she thought he could play both sides. Lena immediately replied that even his simple facial expression already gave her a lot of confidence. However, the sword, angry, asked since when she became so dependent on appearance and stopped trusting him. Cayman, who at that moment was just standing there and watching the girl talk to an inanimate object, asked, "Did she really do that just now?" The girl looked at him in surprise and asked, "Didn't he know that she was actually its owner?" The man became wary and said that, in fact, he knew that this sword had a certain power and that it belonged to him. But Lena, of course, was not going to back down so easily and said that it was a very quiet and calm sword. The man said that it was indeed so. There was an awkward silence between them after that, and Lena responded that the part about her being the owner was a lie. She decided to somehow salvage the situation and asked what he really wanted from her. She also warned him before he spoke that if he lied one more time, she would not open that door again. The guy was silent for a while, after which he introduced himself, giving his name, and said that he was the grandson of Lady Aurelian. As soon as the girl heard this name, she was very surprised and said that she had never heard of this man. Of course, Kamenu was a little surprised by this. However, he said that this was the name of the ruler of this city. She is Aureliana. Then the girl beamed with joy and said that he probably meant her grandmother. The man, hearing this, was very surprised. And Lena explained that after spending several years together at tea parties, she asked him to call her that. Cayman didn't like this very much, so he decided to change the subject and said that in fact, this sword is a very valuable item that can only be used by the head of their family. After that, he turned his gaze to the sword, which was still flying next to them, and said that after his grandmother got divorced and left, the sword simply disappeared. At this point, Lena finally understood why he called her a kitten. As soon as he saw this guy, he assumed that she was also an accomplice in Lewis's escape, just like Grandma. The man replied that when he took the sword, he would properly compensate her for her expenses, and they must definitely come to a common decision. Lena thought for a while, then said that although she understood the situation, the truth was that even if she wanted to give him the sword, she would not be able to do so. Lena didn't even have time to finish her sentence, because the sword immediately flew towards her. He asked her not to give it away, and also said that he would definitely live with her until her hair turned gray, and he would be very faithful to her. Cayman, when he saw this scene, was a little surprised, and then with a trembling voice, he summed up that apparently she really is the true owner of the sword. Louis, meanwhile, continued to scream loudly and even cry. He said that these people considered him their family heirloom. However, they never really cared about him. After this, he turned to Cayman and said that if he really considered him his master, he should tell the girl his real name. Lena calmed the sword and asked him to actually say his true name. Cayman was still a little surprised. However, he wondered if she really wanted him to say that his real name was Lewis. When she nodded her head, he immediately said so, and smiling, Lena replied that it was very good that he knew his name. However, the sword still continued to get angry and scream. He wondered how she could approve of this, since he only said the first part of his name. So Louis thought it would be more important if he said his full name. But Lena tried to calm him down, and said that a normal person wouldn't be able to remember the full pronunciation of his name so easily. However, the sword continued to insist on its own and said that it could not believe that the girl was actually going to do this to him and his feelings. She finally calmed down after a while, Louis, and said that in any case, since it was not a dream, she could not give it to a man, so she asked him to just leave. Cayman wasn't going to just let it go anyway. He said that the value and symbolism of this sword was much greater than she could even imagine. So he explained that he couldn't just leave. He had to get that sword back, even if he had to use a slightly sneaky and unpleasant method to do it. When Lena heard that he mentioned a cunning method, she immediately became wary and did not understand what he meant. At that moment, her patience was already running out, and she said that this sword had its own will, and she could not just give it away without considering his wishes. But Cayman didn't understand how she could say such a thing about a sword because it was a simple weapon, and in this matter, the will of the young lady herself was very important, and not the sword. Also starting to threaten her, he said that he really did not want to use force against such a fragile and beautiful woman. However, if they could not come to an agreement, then he simply had no choice. So he wondered if her answer would still be the same even if he was the most powerful man in the world? Lena replied that, of course, her decision would not change. She would take Lewis's opinion into account in any case, and she did not care at all about his threats. Then Cayman suddenly moved closer to her and said that in that case, he needed to use other methods. However, she did not listen to him any longer. The girl felt how close he was to her and assumed that this was most likely his secret method. Therefore, moving him further away, she asked him to be quieter and also called him her little kitten. Of course, Cayman was very surprised when she did this. After all, no one had ever treated him like that before. And Lena, meanwhile, asked him to be more careful with the words he spoke. The man then completely lost the thread of the conversation and asked what she was talking about. And the girl asked, wasn't he going to propose to her for an arranged marriage? Cayman even felt a little embarrassed by all this and asked why she was even saying such strange things, because he had never even thought about it. Lena was completely confused at the time. She wondered if he had mentioned that he would use underhanded tactics. That was the reason she thought of it. The girl also explained her thoughts by saying that if they got married, the property would be jointly owned, and this is the only legal way for both of them to own this sword. For a while, they were both silent. Then the man said that in that case he wanted to know if she would marry him. At that moment, he put his hand on his heart, bowed, and extended his other hand to hear her answer. Lena even blushed a little at that moment. She couldn't believe that this man really wasn't a swindler, and she also thought that she was very easily influenced by her feelings. But in any case, she thought it would be nice to receive an offer, even like this. The Crown Prince had never made her such an offer. Although, of course, for her it would be ideal with a large bouquet of flowers and a ring, it would be more romantic. However, Lena sighed heavily and said that this was a very uninspiring suggestion and asked if he shouldn't bow elegantly at the waist or something like that. At that moment, the man leaned over again, but a little lower, continuing to extend his hand, and asked if she had anything like that. Lena, meanwhile, blushed and laughed, saying that it was very sweet of him. However, she was forced, unfortunately, to decline the offer. And without even waiting for his reaction, she simply walked away and slammed the door behind her right in his face. The stone, as well as those accompanying it, were incredibly surprised. They stood for some time with their mouths open and their eyes wide open, because they did not understand what had happened at all. After they finally came to their senses, Lena even covered her ears from the scream that came from behind the door. The girl thought that he was very handsome, but his voice certainly wasn't, because she even felt a little disgusted by the scream. Then Lewis spoke to her and said that it was actually his subordinate who was screaming, who was sitting next to him. This guy was just standing there, not understanding how she could refuse him and slam the door in his face. Lena, very surprised to hear this, asked, "Can he really see different things? even through objects? Lewis then smiled smugly and said that he was a magic sword, and seeing through such a shabby wall was nothing compared to the abilities he still possessed. However, at that moment, Lena suddenly realized that she would now have to stay at home, because she could not go outside, because that man was still standing at the entrance.